Well, what's a Canadian looking at today? I hadn't intended to do anything as the sort. I've been having too much fun writing for the publishers. All my little stories, they're loving them. But I heard something today, and I pulled out some work from last year and the year before. 5 years now, you guys, I've been going to school. So my language skills are a little better, and I hope that we can understand what I'm talking about pretty good today. Because I want to know if we're definitely banning pig farms now. So I need to get this straight. In December, on the 6th, in 1998, 14 women were murdered at Polytechnique in Montreal. They were targeted because they were women. They were targeted not merely to be shot. It was being carried out with misogyny and a rifle. And Canada remembered. We built monuments and memorials. We changed laws. We established a National Day of Remembrance and an action on violence against women. And rightly so. Those 14 women deserve their names. They need to be mourned and remembered. But here is the question Canada still doesn't like to answer. Which women become a national tragedy, and which murdered women become paperwork? Because only 2 years later, in 1991, Nancy Clark disappeared from a Victoria street. She was reported missing the next day. Her DNA would eventually be found on Robert Pickton's farm. No charge was ever laid in her death. So apparently, by 1989, Canada had learned how to hold memorials. They had not learned how to listen. And that's the difference that would cost so many women their lives. For years, women disappeared from British Columbia. Indigenous women, poor women, women struggling with addiction, women surviving exploitation, women without influential families or respectable addresses. Families begged. Friends were warned. Women on the street warned one another. But the institutions responsible for protecting them kept behaving as though those women had simply misplaced themselves. Then investigators finally reached Pickton's farm. And suddenly Canada discovered that perhaps the women had not been unreliable. Perhaps the system may have been. Pickton was convicted of murdering 6 women. He was charged in the deaths of 26. The DNA remains of 33 women were found on his property. He claimed he'd killed 49. So I just want some consistency here. 14 women are murdered in Montreal, and we restructured the country around firearms forever. 49 women may have been murdered by one man connected to a pig farm. And what did the police response and the policy response sound like? Wow, that's unfortunate. Anyway, are we banning pig farms now? Because if we're banning objects instead of confronting the person and the institutional failure, I have a list. Pig farms, hammers, brooms, fireplaces, staircases, Menley Michael. Because if one important person dies by a broom, I assume brooms are next. Sorry, you witches, turn them in. Dangerous household assault transportation devices. There will be mandatory broom buybacks. You may retain one Swiffer under ceremonial exemptions. And don't tell me those women weren't important. They were important before somebody found their DNA. They were important before reporters learned. Sally Jessy Raphael was the only one that did some serious research. New York, hey? They were important while the police files were still calling them transient and addicted and unreliable and missing by choice. The failure was not nobody knew women were disappearing. The failure was the people disappearing were women Canada had already placed outside the circle of urgency. And that's how predators survive. Not because nobody sees them, because institutions decide that the people reporting them must be just an inconvenience. And now we arrive at the hammer. A minister is asked what weapon is most commonly used in intimate partner violence. He can't answer. An MP points towards the obvious reality. Much violence against women is committed with the hands. Pushing, punching, beating, choking. Then comes the case of a woman murdered with a hammer. Was she killed by the hammer? Somehow the hammer begins receiving philosophical responsibility. Apparently it developed motive. Perhaps it had a difficult childhood. Maybe the hammer was radicalized at Home Depot. But a hammer doesn't stalk anybody. A rifle doesn't violate a release condition. A broom does not ignore a restraining order. A pig farm does not dismiss any missing women. People choose violence, and institutions choose that they will tolerate. That does not mean tools cannot make violence more lethal. Of course it can. But regulating an object is not suitable for recognizing a violent human being before another woman is dead. Licensed firearm holders they're politically easy. They're targets because they comply. They have licenses. We have information that's recorded. We follow storage rules, transportation rules, submit the background screening, 28-day hold, 24-hour check on my license every 24 hours. And the government knows where to find us. Smugglers are harder. Repeat violent offenders are harder. Institutions that ignore murdered Indigenous women, much harder. Not the smuggler, not the repeat offender, not the institution that ignored warnings after warnings. No. It's the hunter feeding his family, the sports shooter at the exact competition, the indigenous grandmother with a freezer full of moose. That is whom we will shame. Oh, wow. Because paperwork makes wonderful television. Actual prevention requires work. If protecting women were truly the priority, we would begin where lethal violence actually announces itself. Strangulation, stalking, coercive control, threats after separation, repeated breaches of conditions, escalating violence that everybody recognized after the funeral. We would provide rapid legal protection, safe housing, addiction treatment, mental health care, income consistent with being able to flee your abuser. Police who believe a terrified woman before she becomes a homicide statistic. We would disrupt illegal weapons trafficking. We would supervise high-risk violent offenders. We would stop treating breaches as administrative clutter. Because public safety does not mean punishing the person easiest to locate. It means confronting the person who is likely going to hurt somebody. And while we're discussing duty of care, let's talk about what happened when Canada begins, but care is too expensive. Whoa, first the traumatized, then the poor, then the chronically ill, then the inconvenient. After that, hey, Catholics, you ain't using all them churches these days. You know, the recycle bin is over there. That is what happens when a country replaces duty of care with ideology. When housing becomes too costly, treatment becomes too complicated, and disability supports become inconvenient, death begins to appear on the government menu as compassion. Not food, not housing, not care. A form, a consultation, and a beautifully printed brochure on how Canada takes your suffering so serious now that we've decided we will definitely allow you to relieve it. Veterans Affairs acknowledges that 4 inappropriate made conversations involving one employee, 4 is not 0, and although that does not prove a nationwide conspiracy to kill innocent people, it just proves that concern was not imaginary. A country should never make death easier to obtain than support that's required to live. That is not compassion. That is surrendering, wearing a name tag. Canada does not lack laws. Canada does not lack memorials. Canada does not lack speeches delivered once the danger is safely past. Canada lacks the courage to apply care and protection while an inconvenient person is still alive. Which brings us back to Nancy. Nancy disappeared in Victoria in August 1991. She was 25 years old. She was reported missing the next day, and again, her DNA was found on Robert Picton's farm. But nobody was ever charged with killing her. I'm telling you, nobody. Nancy did not need Canada to remember her 30 years later. They needed Canada to notice she was gone. They needed somebody to believe that her absence mattered. She needed urgency before the evidence was reduced to DNA on somebody else's property. So when politicians say they're protecting women, I don't want to hear another slogan. I don't want to hear another object blamed for developing evil intentions. I don't want another expensive program aimed at the citizens who usually follow the law. I want them to answer a question. When my friend Nancy disappeared, where was Canada? Nancy was not inconvenient evidence. She was not a category. She was not collateral damage in somebody else's policy argument. She was a woman. She was alive. And she mattered before anybody found her. Maybe we can stop putting the violence off to the next parliament session and think about the women who are worried about tomorrow's bail hearing. My name's Laura Biggs, and that's my time.